that was even a more interesting visit in some ways. But the first thing you notice as an outsider, as a quote-unquote American, and Americans go from the North Pole to the South Pole, so I don't like to use that word, but I don't like a United Stater either. It just doesn't have that. So as a U.S. American is what I've come to settle on. It was interesting going there because the Iranian people really do like people from the United States. I still can't figure it out. Given the history and so on. But I think part of it has to do with they draw a distinction between the government and the people. And they're so proud of their own history, 8,000-year-old history, and that's contributed so much to the world. And they know they're viewed in a very terrible, negative way by the West. And they really want to convince you that it's not true. And then, of course, there's just a long history, of hospitality in a country that is crisscrossed by caravan trades and has always consciously played a role of people who extend hospitality to strangers and travelers. This is part of the culture. So, when we went over there, we thought, well, okay, we're not gonna touch the issue of the government. That's not what we're going there for. We're going there, number one, to show you can go there, because so many people were afraid, to go to Iran, and we weren't just going to Tehran. We were going to take a van trip around the country, from Shiraz and Yazd and Esfahan and home. It was about 1,350 miles altogether. On the van, a little bit on the air, and we didn't believe that it was the way we were told it. We didn't believe it was that dangerous. We believed that what our Iranian American friends told us, that we'd have a wonderful experience, and we did. The second thing we wanted to do was to express to as many Iranians as we could the desire of the American people to have peace with the world. I'm not going to say there's a sense of solidarity. That would be going way too far, and I think we have to look reality in the face. People in the United States don't get information that's accurate, and if they did, I think their basic goodness would come through. What they get is a lot of lies and an attempt to make them afraid of everyone in the world. They're even a little bit nervous about Canadians. So that was a second reason, to extend a hand of friendship and peace to the Iranian people and to try to bring back what we knew would be their gestures to the U.S. And the third was just to poke a finger in the eye of George Bush and Dick Cheney. And because they're advising people, they're advising U.S. citizens not to go to Iran, and if you did, you should register with the State Department. And so I registered for the draft when I was 18, and that was all the registration I wanted to do with the U.S. government. So we went, and one of the things we found out was some of the things that the Iranian government does for the people. The philosophy of the government appears to be a concern for the poor. Now, the Iranian government isn't monolithic. There are people in many different factions, many different organizations, many different points of view. There are those who really do favor the privatization of the economy, and there are those who are fighting very hard against that. There are those who think that programs of social welfare are treating people, teaching them to have a victimization mentality. I think those of us in the U.S. know that as the Republican line about social programs. And there are those who feel that the wealth of the country should be used to benefit primarily those who have been denied an opportunity to earn a decent living and care for their families and so on. So I started becoming a little more sympathetic to the government. And as time went on, I became more sympathetic. And began to see that and even at that point in 2007, I would meet people who were critical of the government, and all of their criticisms were not invalid. There's much progress that needs to be made in Iran, as there is in any country. It's probably the most democratic country in the entire Middle East, but there are things that could be improved. But I noticed that the people who were most hostile to the government were the ones who were the most better off. There's an issue of class. And they also tend to be much more sympathetic to the role that the U.S. government is playing in the world, and much less hostile to Israel, and much less concerned about the plight of the Palestinians. That's painting it with a very, very broad brush. But as a general rule, I think that is true. And one of the things I've been criticized for a lot by right-wing Iranian Americans is suggesting that the Iranian government is legitimate. That not only was the election in 2009 legitimate, and we could talk all about the reasons why I think that, and I wrote a pamphlet about it. You're welcome to check that out also. But 2/3 of the people are working class and poor, and maybe 1/3 is middle class, and the vote broke down 1/3 to 2/3. And when people say, the Iranian people rose up and condemned the election, well, some of the Iranian people did. But not everybody in Iran is a yuppie. That's not true. There's a lot of working class people, a lot of poor people that have benefited from the revolution. So that gets into the question of a government that represses its own people. Also gets into the question of a government that supposedly is run by religious fanatics who don't care about the here and now because they're only focused on the future. Well, Jesus Christ fed the multitudes with loaves and fishes. He didn't say, don't worry about it because someday you're going to die and go to heaven. He was concerned about the welfare of poor people, those who don't have things, don't have enough to eat. And I saw far more concern for the poor and disenfranchised in Iran than I've ever seen from my own government in the United States. But what about the number one issue? The number one issue, which is that Iran is trying to develop nuclear weapons. And this is the charge that is made over and over and over again, even though there is not one scintilla of evidence that it's true. Not from the United Nations inspection team with the International Atomic Energy Agency, not with the U.S. Central Intelligence Agency, not from the Israeli Mossad. No one has been able to come up with any bit of evidence that Iran is actually trying to develop nuclear weapons. It has a program to develop nuclear power for peaceful energy purposes. They told me I don't get chicken tonight if I speak too long, so I just wanted to double check. No, I'm kidding, sorry. Iran has the right to develop nuclear energy for peaceful energy purposes. It signed the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty of the United Nations, which states that if a country does not have nuclear weapons and promises not to develop it, it not only will be recognized as having the right to develop nuclear power for electricity purposes, but it will receive assistance from those countries that already have that power, already have that expertise. So under this treaty that the vast majority of countries in the world have signed, Iran has the right not only to develop nuclear power, but to say to the United States, hey, give us a hand here, help us put this thing together. But instead, the U.S. government states that, well, yeah, you have a right to develop nuclear power. Secretary of State Clinton has stated that several times. But we think that you're just using that program as a cover to develop nuclear weapons. Well, how can Iran prove that it isn't doing that? You can't prove a negative. You can't prove that I'm not planning tonight to rob 3 banks on my way back to Virginia. I can tell you I'm not, but they go, yeah, but you're going to pass a lot of banks on the way home, and it's a possibility. What's the matter? You don't want money? Oh, I wouldn't mind having money, but I'm not going to rob a bank for it. Well, that's what you say, but you're a nut. That's what they do. Of course Iran wants to develop nuclear weapons. Number one, they have a fanatically dangerous government, and number two, they want to destroy Israel. It doesn't, well, if they're so fanatically religious, then how come when Ayatollah Khomeini issues a fatwa saying it would be a sin against Islam to develop nuclear weapons, that the West doesn't mention it and doesn't take it seriously? And when I tell that to audiences in the West, they go, yeah, well, of course they're going to say that. All right, that's a valid argument. They could just be saying that. But during the 8-year war between Iraq and Iran, when Saddam used chemical and biological warfare against the Iranian soldiers and people and carried out mass aerial bombings of Iranian cities, and members of the military who had served under the Shah came to Ayatollah Khomeini and said, we want to respond likewise, he said no. You can't do that. That would be against Islam. That's a weapon of mass destruction, and you can't do it. And he issued a fatwa against it, and the United Nations inspection teams say that Iran never responded in kind, despite losing 600,000 or more people. You can't have it both ways. I better brush up on my Arabic before I make another remark like that. So you can't have it both ways, you know, either they're religious or they're not religious, you know, and so other countries have come forward, the non-aligned movement, the Organization of Islamic Countries. Some 70% of all countries in the world have gone on record as stating that Iran does have the right to develop nuclear power for peaceful energy purposes. And but yet it has been hit with round after round after round of sanctions. It's the one thing that scares people in the United States the most, and they're going to keep that up until they think that they can undermine the government by imposing sanctions that will hurt the average person and cause them to rise up against the Islamic government in Iran. I don't think that's going to happen. I know this is not Egypt. You know, people say, you know, there's all these arguments now about, you know, why didn't it happen in Iran like it's happening in Egypt? Well, for one thing, the leadership in Iran are not subservient, craven puppets of U.S. imperialism. They defy U.S. imperialism. As a matter of fact, there's no one in the Green Movement that denies that Iran has the right to develop nuclear power. No one is calling for Iran to surrender in that score. No one is calling for sanctions on the higher levels of the Green Movement, and no one is certainly calling for an invasion. So there are class differences, there are questions of different views on how politics should be carried out, and there are abuses that have taken place in Iran that fortunately major figures in the government have acknowledged and tried to address, but it's a struggle. You know, I don't like to paint a picture like everything is perfect. No, nothing's perfect everywhere, and things are not perfect in Iran. They're better than they are in most other countries in the Middle East, and for a poor person is better off in Iran than they are in the United States. That is true. That is true. I happen to be one of those 50 million people who don't have health insurance. You know, the poverty level in Richmond, Virginia, which is a majority black city, is 25.7%. 25.7%. The unemployment rate is only 7.5%, which tells you a lot of people working and making wages that don't lift them out of poverty. How about supporting terrorism? One person's freedom fighter is another person's terrorist. That's a truism. I grew up in Boston, Massachusetts, where there's monuments all over the state to the farmers who used to keep their guns close by, so that when they got the call, they would rush out in the woods and hide behind trees and shoot the British troops as they rode by. And of course, the British regarded them as, you know, whatever word they used that would be the equivalent of terrorists. I put it in my book that the British regarded them as terrorists, and my mother called me on it. She said, they didn't use that word back then. Well, she's right. She's kind of a self-made historian. So she gave me a lot of good advice on the book. But Iran doesn't support Al-Qaeda. They're sworn enemies. Iran helped the U.S. get the Taliban out of Afghanistan. Got very little credit for it, but played that role. But when a people rise up against oppression, when Israel invades a country and thinks they can take it over, take advantage of the fact that there's a weak government there, and a popular resistance movement rises up and drives them back out of the country, that's not terrorism. That's not terrorism. And when construction companies move into your neighborhood and start kicking you out of your homes and tearing your ancestral homes down and building condos for settlers from Brooklyn, New York, and people rise up to try to drive them out, that's not terrorism either. That's resistance. That's resistance. And Iran supports resistance against oppression. So